Before the documentary begins, I would like to brief in a few lines first on the title, Great Zimbabwe, the Lost African Forgotten Kingdom. Imagine a city so magnificent, yet built a fortress that defied time itself. But then, it vanished. No records, no written history, no trace of the kings who ruled it. Only the ruins remain, massive granite walls stretching into the wilderness, holding secrets buried for centuries. Who built Great Zimbabwe? Why was it abandoned? And why did the world spend decades denying that Africans could have built something so extraordinary? Tonight, we journey into the silence of the stones to uncover a civilization the world tried to erase. The sun sets over the savannas of southern Africa. The wind hums through ancient stone corridors, brushing against the ruins that once stood as the beating heart of a forgotten empire. Great Zimbabwe, once a powerful kingdom, now an archaeological riddle carved from raw granite. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, this city was once home to over 20,000 people, a center of trade, gold, and mystery. But its origins, for centuries, were stolen, twisted, and buried under colonial lies. For decades, explorers refused to believe Africans could have built something so majestic. They blamed lost tribes, foreign settlers, even ancient Phoenicians, anyone but the people who called this land home. But the stones never lie. This is the story of a kingdom that defied history, and the silence that followed its fall. Before we uncover the truth buried beneath the ruins, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we bring forgotten civilizations back to life, one mystery at a time. Let us now begin the complete documentary on Great Zimbabwe, the Lost African Kingdom the World Tried to Erase, Forgotten Civilizations documentary, a tale of glory, betrayal, and rediscovery, where forgotten history rises once more from the stones. In the vast grasslands of southern Africa, surrounded by rolling hills and golden plains, something extraordinary began to rise. Around the year 1100 AD, in what would one day become modern-day Zimbabwe, a group of builders began shaping granite stones with remarkable precision. They used no mortar, no cement, no iron tools, only fire, water, and their own ingenuity. Each stone was carved to fit perfectly into another, creating walls that curved gracefully across the landscape. From the ashes of the earth, a kingdom began to take form. Great Zimbabwe was not born from conquest or colonization. It was born from vision, from the rhythm of a people who understood their land and its secrets. The builders worked with patience and pride, laying stone upon stone until the fortress grew into a sprawling city, a marvel of human achievement that would one day stand as one of Africa's greatest wonders. The people who lived there were the ancestors of the Shona, a people deeply connected to the land, its spirit, and its rhythms. They were traders, farmers, and artisans. They carved their existence into the soil and built a civilization whose influence stretched far beyond their borders. From the banks of the Zambezi River to the coasts of Mozambique, Great Zimbabwe became the beating heart of a vast trade network that pulsed with life and wealth. Merchants from distant lands, Arabia, India, and China, found their way here, drawn by tales of gold and ivory. Caravans laden with goods passed through the savannah, carrying fabrics, spices, and ceramics that would eventually be unearthed centuries later by archaeologists, each fragment whispering the same truth. This was once a city that connected Africa to the world. At its core stood the Hill Complex, the spiritual and political center of power. It wasn't merely a fortress. It was the throne of kings. From its summit, rulers gazed down upon their city, watching smoke rise from thousands of huts, listening to the echoes of drums carried by the wind. The king was more than a ruler. He was believed to be the link between the living and the spirits of the ancestors. His rule was not written in law or carved into stone, but in the deep respect his people held for tradition and divine balance. The great enclosure below the hill was unlike anything ever seen in Africa at that time. Its walls stood over 30 feet high, enclosing a space large enough to hold hundreds of people. Within it stood the mysterious conical tower, a massive, solid stone structure whose purpose remains unknown. Some say it represented a granary, a symbol of prosperity. Others believe it stood as a sacred symbol of authority and fertility. Whatever its purpose, it was a masterpiece, a silent monument to the wealth and sophistication of a society that understood architecture not as construction, but as expression. As the city expanded, its influence grew. Villages and smaller settlements sprouted across the region, all connected by trade and loyalty. Gold from the nearby rivers was mined and exchanged for foreign goods, bringing prosperity and prestige. Great Zimbabwe became a symbol of strength, a city of stone rising from the wilderness, proving that civilization did not need foreign hands to create greatness. Its builders had no need for written scripts. Their story was etched into every wall, every stone, every path. Yet even in its glory, Great Zimbabwe was shrouded in quiet mystery. There were no royal inscriptions, no carvings naming its kings. The people who built it seemed to speak through the silence of their craft, leaving behind something greater than words, a testament of existence that would outlast empires. The city's heartbeat pulsed in rhythm with the earth, and its people lived knowing they were part of something vast and eternal. This was the birth of a hidden empire, one that rose not through conquest or divine right, but through wisdom, craftsmanship, and unity. It was a world built on stone and spirit, where power flowed not from written decrees, but from the very essence of the land itself. Great Zimbabwe stood as proof that greatness can rise anywhere, even in silence, even in the heart of Africa, where the stones themselves seemed to breathe with the memory of those who built them. When the explorers from Europe first laid eyes on the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe in the late 1800s, they stood in stunned disbelief. The massive granite enclosures curved and climbed across the earth like waves of frozen motion, each block perfectly balanced without the help of mortar. Towers rose toward the sky, and passageways led deep into courtyards that hinted at once bustling markets and royal gatherings. To those who came from far away, steeped in the arrogance of empire, it was impossible to accept that Africans, without foreign influence, had built something so grand, so refined, so far beyond their narrow imagination. And so instead of wonder came denial, instead of admiration came theft. The story of Great Zimbabwe was stripped from the people who built it and rewritten to fit the comfort of colonial minds. The British colonizers and treasure hunters came not seeking truth, but validation of their own myths of superiority. Among them was Cecil Rhodes, a man whose hunger for power and gold blinded him to the humanity of the people he ruled. When his agents stumbled upon the ruins, they were convinced that this magnificent city must have been built by outsiders, ancient Phoenicians, Arabs, or the lost tribes of Israel, anyone but black Africans. The idea that the Shona people could have engineered and governed such an advanced civilization clashed with the racist logic that justified their empire. To accept the truth would mean admitting that Africa was not a land of savagery waiting to be civilized, but one that had once thrived in its own right. Archaeological evidence that pointed to an African origin was deliberately ignored or destroyed. Artifacts unearthed from the ruins, pottery, iron tools, beads, and carvings, all bore the unmistakable signature of local craftsmanship, yet reports were rewritten to attribute them to foreign cultures. Early excavators manipulated findings to fit their lies, often claiming they had found traces of non-African artifacts that later turned out to be planted or misrepresented. The colonial narrative hardened into doctrine. Great Zimbabwe was a mystery, yes, but one that could never belong to Africans. Schools across the colonies taught this distortion as fact. Museums displayed models crediting foreigners with the city's creation. Even maps labeled the region as a site of ancient white settlers, erasing centuries of African history with the stroke of a pen. To the colonizers, this wasn't just about archaeology, it was about control. If they could deny that Africans were capable of greatness, they could justify their conquest as a mission of enlightenment. The walls of Great Zimbabwe became symbolic battlegrounds, not of stone and mortar, but of truth and power. Yet beneath the lies, the stones remained patient. They did not bend to prejudice. The carvings, the patterns, the circular designs all spoke the language of the land and its people. The more the colonizers tried to bury the truth, the stronger the silence of the ruins became. The local Shona people continued to tell their stories, whispered through generations, that this was the home of their ancestors, the city of their kings. But the world refused to listen. For decades, the myth persisted. Academics in Europe published papers filled with false conclusions. Missionaries declared the ruins a cursed place, unworthy of attention. Even when African voices tried to reclaim their history, they were dismissed as unscientific, emotional, or primitive. Colonialism had not only taken land and lives, it had taken identity. The greatness of Great Zimbabwe was turned into a ghost story, one that hid the brilliance of its creators behind walls of ignorance and greed. But the truth cannot stay buried forever. The stones, standing silently under the African sun, were not just ruins. They were witnesses. Every curve, every fracture, every carefully placed block carried the fingerprints of those who built them. As time passed and the world began to awaken from the haze of colonial arrogance, researchers would return to these ruins not with shovels of conquest, but with questions of humility. And slowly the truth would begin to emerge once again, pushing through the cracks of history, like roots reclaiming the earth that once belonged to them. The silence that had long protected Great Zimbabwe began to break in the early decades of the 20th century, when archaeologists who refused to accept colonial myths returned to the ruins, not with greed, but with reverence. They came not to claim the stones, but to listen to them. As they sifted through the dust and fragments of history, the earth began to give back its truth. Beneath layers of denial and distortion lay evidence so clear, so unmistakably African, that even the most stubborn myths could not hold. Pottery shards bearing Shona designs, iron smelting furnaces built in the traditional style, ornaments carved from local soapstone, all spoke the same story. The builders of Great Zimbabwe were the ancestors of the people who still lived on that land. The stones had waited patiently, and now they began to speak. As excavations deepened, the story of an ingenious civilization began to reemerge. The builders of Great Zimbabwe had mastered the art of shaping granite through fire and water. They heated the stones until they cracked along their natural seams, then cooled them to form perfect blocks. With no written instructions, no blueprints, they constructed walls that curved naturally with the landscape, defying geometric rigidity. Every curve followed the rhythm of the hills, the flow of the wind, and the placement of the sun. The builders understood the balance between form and nature in ways modern architecture still struggles to replicate. Their city was not imposed upon the land, it grew from it. The artifacts unearthed revealed a society of sophistication and connectivity. Glass beads from Persia, Chinese porcelain, and Arabian coins lay side by side with local crafts and tools, proving that Great Zimbabwe had once been a major hub in the global trade network. Gold from the region's rivers had reached as far as India and the Middle East, exchanged for silks, spices, and exotic goods. The city was not isolated or primitive. It was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and deeply organized. Its rulers governed a complex society built on agriculture, commerce, and spiritual balance. Within the city walls, the architecture told silent stories of hierarchy and symbolism. The great enclosure, with its high, sweeping walls, was likely a royal or ceremonial space, a physical manifestation of power and divine connection. At its heart stood the mysterious conical tower, rising like a pillar of faith. Some believe it represented a granary, a symbol of abundance and the king's duty to feed his people. Others see it as a sacred monument linking heaven and earth. Whatever its true meaning, its craftsmanship reflected not just skill, but purpose. Everything built here had meaning, and nothing was accidental. The rediscovery of these truths shook the foundations of the colonial narrative. Slowly, the world began to accept what had always been evident. Great Zimbabwe was an African creation, a masterpiece of engineering and vision born from the soil of its own people. Scholars who once dismissed the idea of African achievement were now forced to face undeniable evidence. The myth of foreign builders collapsed under the weight of truth. For the people of Zimbabwe, this rediscovery was more than archaeological. It was personal. It was the return of dignity, the restoration of a voice long silenced. The stones, once robbed of their identity, now stood as proof of what had always been true, that Africa had its own architects, its own thinkers, its own greatness. The ruins became a monument not of mystery, but of resilience. And yet, even as the truth emerged, questions remained. The stones could tell of how the kingdom lived, traded, and thrived, but they could not fully explain how it fell. Somewhere between the echoes of prosperity and the whispers of abandonment, the story of Great Zimbabwe took a turn into silence once again. A civilization that had once touched the stars suddenly vanished, leaving only the breath of the wind against its ancient walls. The stones had spoken of greatness, but they had not yet spoken of loss. As the 15th century unfolded, the heart of Great Zimbabwe began to slow its rhythm. The walls that had once echoed with the sound of trade, laughter, and royal ceremonies now stood in eerie stillness. The vibrant marketplaces where gold and ivory exchanged hands grew quiet. The songs that once rose from the valleys faded into the distance, replaced by the restless whisper of the wind. No single event marked the fall of Great Zimbabwe. It was not a collapse in battle or a disaster written in ash. Instead, it was a gradual fading, a slow unraveling of a kingdom that had once stood as the center of southern Africa's power and pride. For generations, the city had thrived on trade. Gold was its lifeblood, connecting its people to faraway merchants who came seeking riches from the heart of Africa. But trade routes began to shift. The power of the Swahili coast grew stronger, and new centers of exchange emerged closer to the sea. The caravans that once wound their way to Great Zimbabwe began to dwindle. As commerce moved eastward, the city's influence began to wane. Without the constant flow of goods and wealth, the great stone city started to lose the pulse that had sustained it for centuries. The land, too, may have turned against its people. The soil surrounding the city, once rich and fertile, began to wear thin from overuse. Fields that had fed thousands could no longer yield as they once did. Drought crept through the plains, and the rivers that had glittered with gold began to dry. The once reliable rains came late or not at all, leaving the people to face hunger and uncertainty. Livestock weakened, crops failed, and whispers of divine displeasure spread through the settlements. The harmony between the people and their land, a bond that had built Great Zimbabwe, was breaking. Within the royal enclosures, power began to shift. The king's authority, once unquestioned, faced internal divisions and rivalries. Nobles and regional leaders, sensing weakness, sought to establish their own centers of control. Slowly, the unity that had bound the empire together began to fracture. Some historians believe that new settlements, such as Kami and Mapungubwe, rose from these divisions, successor states that carried fragments of Great Zimbabwe's legacy but lacked its scale and central power. The royal court may have moved, abandoning the granite walls to the wilderness, seeking new lands where fortune and fertility still lingered. Disease may have played its part as well. With trade came exposure to new illnesses that swept through the population, leaving families broken and communities weakened. Combined with famine and unrest, the great city may have become unsustainable for the tens of thousands who once called it home. As the population thinned, houses were left empty, paths overgrown, and the fires that once lit the city's heart flickered out one by one. Yet even as its people dispersed, they did not vanish. They carried their stories, their traditions, and their reverence for the sacred stones into the lands beyond. The name Zimbabwe, meaning House of Stone, lived on in their songs and oral histories, passed down through generations. The city itself fell into silence, its towering walls reclaimed by the wilderness. But its spirit endured in memory. When European colonizers stumbled upon its ruins centuries later, they believed they had discovered a lost city. But it had never been lost. It had simply returned to the earth from which it was born. The people who built it were still there, their bloodline unbroken, their culture alive, even if their city had turned to ruins. The stones stood as sentinels of a forgotten age, weathered but unyielding, their surfaces marked by time but not defeat. Great Zimbabwe's fall was not an ending. It was a transformation. Empires rise, flourish, and fade, but greatness leaves traces that no wind can erase. The kingdom may have vanished from sight, but its story, carved into granite and carried in spirit, refused to die. It waited patiently beneath the African sky, waiting for the day when the world would once again remember the city that had once ruled in silence and splendor. Today, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand as both a monument and a message. The city that was once buried in silence now breathes again, its story reclaimed by the very people whose ancestors built it. The massive granite walls, weathered yet unbroken, rise against the African sky like guardians of memory, whispering truths that were once denied. For centuries, outsiders tried to erase its origin, to rewrite its history, to strip it of its pride. But the stones endured. They outlasted the conquerors, the liars, and the hands that sought to claim them. Time, in its quiet justice, returned the truth to where it belonged. In the modern nation of Zimbabwe, the ruins are no longer seen as relics of mystery, but as symbols of strength. The name Zimbabwe itself was chosen when the country gained independence in 1980, a deliberate act of restoration, a declaration that history would no longer be defined by colonial lies. The House of Stone had given its name to a new nation, binding the present to its rightful past. The walls that once enclosed kings now represent the resilience of a people who survived erasure, who endured invasion and distortion, yet refused to let their story fade. Archaeologists and historians continue to study the ruins, not to uncover foreign secrets, but to deepen understanding of the brilliance that once existed there. The evidence left behind paints a portrait of a society advanced in architecture, trade, and governance, one that existed in harmony with its environment long before industrialization reshaped the world. The dry stone techniques used by its builders remain a marvel, structures that have survived earthquakes, storms, and centuries without mortar, standing as silent proof of engineering genius. The artifacts displayed in museums today no longer serve as trophies of colonial conquest, but as pieces of a restored narrative. Fragments of pride return to their rightful story. Yet the legacy of Great Zimbabwe extends beyond the stones. It challenges the world to reconsider how history is told and who gets to tell it. For too long, Africa's greatness was measured through the lens of outsiders who saw its past as a blank slate awaiting discovery. The truth of Great Zimbabwe stands as defiance, a reminder that civilizations flourished on this continent long before colonizers arrived. The city's rediscovery did not reveal a mystery. It exposed a lie. The grandeur of the ruins is not just architectural. It is moral, a testament to the endurance of truth against centuries of denial. To the people of Zimbabwe, the site is sacred ground. Pilgrims, scholars, and locals walk through its passageways with reverence, tracing the same paths their ancestors once walked. Children learn its history in schools, no longer as myth, but as legacy. Artists carve its image, musicians sing its story, and storytellers speak of the city of stones that refuse to be silenced. Great Zimbabwe has become more than a place. It is an identity, a pulse that beats within the nation's soul. Even beyond Africa, the ruins inspire reflection. They remind the world that greatness does not always wear crowns of gold or rise from marble palaces. Sometimes it is born in the soil, built by hands that work in rhythm with nature, driven by belief and purpose. Great Zimbabwe is a reminder that progress and civilization are not the gifts of empire. They are the birthright of humanity. The stones that once stood alone now speak to millions, teaching that history can be taken, twisted, buried, but never destroyed. As the sun sets over the granite walls, shadows stretch across the land like echoes of the past reaching into the present. The city may have fallen, its people may have scattered, but its spirit remains unbroken. Great Zimbabwe endures as the voice of a forgotten kingdom, reclaimed from silence and restored to truth. It stands as a testament to resilience, a monument to the brilliance of Africa, and a promise to future generations that no matter how deeply history is buried, the earth will always remember. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe still stand beneath the African sky, their silence heavy with secrets not yet spoken. The truth has been unearthed, But not all mysteries rest beneath these stones. Because across the continent, scattered among the sands and jungles, lie more forgotten kingdoms, more buried truths waiting to rise. What if this lost empire was only the beginning? One chapter in a much larger story the world was never meant to remember. The past is calling once again, and its next revelation may change everything we think we know about civilization itself.